Welcome to my channel. Here we respond to comments. So, here we go. One viewer said, "This was kind of disappointing. I agree it's a very nuanced and complicated subject, but you barely touched on what the Bible has to say about the actual slavery in the Old Testament." There was a longer reply. You can view all their comments by watching my videos on atheism and slavery. Now, here is my response to their reply. This is an important topic that requires careful attention. Here's a response to your concerns, engaging with the Old Testament's view on slavery, while considering the historical context and addressing common comparisons with American slavery. Slavery in the Old Testament, a historical context. The Bible does reference slavery, but it's essential to understand it within the context of the ancient Near East. During this period, slavery was a widespread institution across various cultures. In the ancient Near East, slavery functioned as a complex system of labor, debt management, and war reparations, differing significantly from the race-based, dehumanizing chattel slavery practiced in the Americas. Key biblical texts on slavery. Foreign slaves, Leviticus chapter 25, verses 44 to 46. This passage states that Israelites could acquire slaves from surrounding nations, and that these slaves could become permanent household members. The text does say, "You may bequeath them to your children as inherited property, and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly." Analysis. This suggests that foreign slaves were treated differently from Israelite servants, often serving for life. However, it does not equate directly to chattel slavery as practiced in the Americas, where slaves were denied any personal dignity or family structure. In the Bible, foreign slaves often lived within households, participated in religious rituals, and could marry into the family, like Abraham's servant Hagar in Genesis chapter 16. Though the treatment might seem harsh to modern readers, ancient Near Eastern slavery was less focused on racial division and more on social and economic functions. Protections for slaves. Exodus chapter 21 verses 20 to 21 and 26 to 27. The Bible does include some regulations intended to prevent extreme mistreatment of slaves. If a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies as a direct result, he must be punished. But if the slave recovers after a day or two, he is not to be punished, since the slave is his property. If a man hits a slave in the eye and destroys it, the slave must be set free to compensate for the eye. Analysis. These verses reflect limits on physical punishment and offer some protections. The death of a slave due to mistreatment carried consequences for the master, and permanent injury required emancipation. These rules indicate that total dehumanization and unchecked brutality were discouraged, although slavery was still permitted and seen as part of societal norms. The Jubilee year. Leviticus chapter 25 verse 10. Every 50th year, known as the Jubilee, debts were forgiven, and enslaved Israelites were to be freed. This reflects a vision of restorative justice and underscores that Israelite servitude was never intended to be lifelong. Foreign slaves were not included in the Jubilee system, which raises ethical concerns by modern standards, but within the historical context, it was intended to prevent permanent generational poverty among Israelites. Differences and similarities between biblical and American slavery. Key differences: race. Biblical slavery was not race-based, unlike American slavery, which was based on the belief in racial superiority. In the Bible, slaves could often integrate into households or convert to Israel's faith, as seen in Exodus chapter 12 verse 48, whereas American slavery kept African slaves permanently alienated from white society. Religious participation. In the Bible, slaves could participate in religious rituals and become part of the covenant community. For example, foreign slaves could partake in the Passover if circumcised, as stated in Exodus chapter 12 verse 44. This integration contrasts with American slavery, where enslaved people were often barred from religious expression or were given distorted versions of Christianity to justify their oppression. Legal protections. Although the Bible allowed for the ownership of foreign slaves, it placed some legal limits on mistreatment, as noted in Exodus chapter 21 verses 26 to 27. In contrast, American slavery had minimal legal protections, and violence was often a tool of control. Key similarities: lifelong slavery for foreigners. Both biblical and American slavery allowed for permanent enslavement. Leviticus chapter 25 verses 44 to 46 makes clear that foreign slaves could be inherited as property, similar to how enslaved people in America were treated as inheritable property. Economic exploitation. In both contexts, slavery was closely tied to economic gain. Foreign slaves in Israelite households and African slaves in America both contributed to their master's wealth through labor and domestic work. Dehumanization. While biblical slavery included some safeguards, the practice of owning people as property inherently involves some level of dehumanization. The idea that slaves were property is present in both biblical and American systems, even if the degree of brutality differed. Conclusion: an ethical and theological reflection. It is understandable to feel disturbed by the similarities between biblical slavery and American slavery, especially since both involve the ownership of people. While the Bible provides some protections and integration opportunities for slaves, the fundamental reality of being treated as property cannot be ignored. However, it's crucial to interpret these texts within their historical context, where slavery was a social norm rather than a moral ideal. It's also important to note that the New Testament shifts the focus away from institutional slavery towards spiritual freedom. Paul's letters encourage treating slaves as brothers in Christ, as seen in Philemon chapter 1 verse 16, and suggests that in Christ there is neither slave nor free, as stated in Galatians chapter 3 verse 28. This reflects a move toward equality that contrasts with both the Old Testament view and American slavery practices. Ultimately, the Bible reflects the realities of the ancient world, but it also points toward a higher moral vision where all people are treated with dignity and respect. As Christians interpret these texts today, the emphasis should be on the spiritual principles of love, justice, and equality that underlie the gospel, rather than justifying ancient practices in modern contexts. This nuanced understanding helps address the complexity of slavery in the Bible without shying away from difficult questions about the ethics of these passages. It reminds us that while the Bible contains challenging texts, it also provides a trajectory of moral progress that ultimately points toward freedom and human dignity. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. I will see you in the comments.